Welcome, my sleepy sojourner, to a tranquil voyage through the mists of time. As the day's toils drift away and your eyelids grow heavy, we embark on a journey to ages past, an era of valiant knights, towering castles, and majestic cathedrals soaring to the heavens. Yet beyond these romantic visions lie the gritty realities of life in the Middle Ages, where existence was too often nasty, brutish, and short. Before we delve into those fascinating yet challenging times, I invite you to pause for a moment and leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from, and what hour finds you seeking repose in our humble historical narrative. Are you snuggled up in Stockholm as the midnight sun dips below the horizon? Perhaps you're winding down in Winchester after a spot of afternoon tea. Or maybe you're rising with the rosy-fingered dawn in Delhi, preparing to face the day ahead. Wherever you may be, know that you are most welcome here. If you find yourself charmed by our quiet meanderings through the parchment pages of history, consider subscribing so as not to miss future installments crafted to edify and lull you into gentle slumber. And now, let us set the stage for our tale. Picture, if you will, a typical town in medieval Europe, a jumble of half-timbered houses huddled together within stout stone walls. Smoke rises from chimneys as the inhabitants go about their daily business, the blacksmith hammering away at his forge, the baker sliding crusty loaves into a clay oven, the weaver plying her loom with nimble fingers. Church bells toll the hours while children scamper through narrow, muddy streets. At first blush, it all seems rather quaint and cozy. But alas, life in the Middle Ages was seldom a gentle idyll. Squalor, ignorance, pestilence and violence were sad facts of everyday existence for rich and poor alike. The townsfolk faced an endless litany of woes: scant, spoiled food, shoddy sanitation, rampant crime, scorching summers, spirit-crushing winters, and the constant spectre of death from accident, warfare, or horrific disease. Of course, some corners of medieval society were even more wretched than others, veritable hellscapes, where only the strongest, luckiest, or most ruthless could hope to survive. In the lowest, darkest pits of suffering, we find decrepit prisons with their broken captives, putrid plague hospitals overflowing with the doomed and dying, desolate monasteries where holy men waged lonely battles against doubt and despair. As we drift off into restful reverie, we shall visit some of these forsaken places and meet a few of the ill-starred souls who called them home. We'll walk a mile in their worn, louse-ridden shoes and gain a richer understanding of their hardships, their heartaches, their small yet hard-won joys. So come, let us hie to bed and immerse ourselves in the vivid, unvarnished, oft-times unpleasant truth of living and dying in the Middle Ages. Part 1. Cities and Towns. 1. Overcrowded cities. Our first stop is London in the year of our Lord 1272. A teeming anthill of 80,000 souls packed into a labyrinth of crooked lanes and rickety wooden tenements. The air hangs heavy with the stench of emptied chamber pots, rotting offal, and thick, greasy smoke from untold cook fires and workshops. Rivers of waste ooze down open gutters to pool in noxious bogs that fester with flies. Meanwhile, livestock and loose dogs roam free, further fouling the fetid streets. For the common folk, home is a ramshackle affair, a 1 or 2 room hovel with low ceilings, glassless windows, and a packed dirt floor strewn with rushes. Here, an entire family must eat, sleep, and ply their trade in suffocating proximity, with scant water, warmth, or ventilation. Tattered clothing and bedding swarm with fleas and lice. Cloying wood smoke stings the eyes, but fails to fully mask the reek of unwashed bodies. If this wasn't misery enough, such close quarters are an incubator for contagion, from mundane maladies like measles and influenza to the periodic ravages of leprosy and plague. Even a simple scratch can turn deadly thanks to poor hygiene. Untreated sewage poisons wells and fouls the very air, unleashing waves of dysentery and cholera. Those who don't succumb to disease risk perishing in one of the many fires that regularly rampage through timber-built blocks. Consider the plight of Will Fletcher, a humble bowyer and loving family man. Each day he must rise before dawn to toil at his trade in the cramped front room, crafting bows of yew and ash amid heaps of wood shavings and the pungent stench of rendered animal glue. His wife Joan and their 3 children share the tiny back room, which also serves as the kitchen. Meals are cooked over an open hearth, filling the space with smoke that seeps into the rough sheets and mildewed straw mattress. Little Jack, the youngest, has a hacking cough that keeps the family awake and raises the spectre of consumption, while his sisters sniffle and scratch at weeping, pox-laden sores. Will wishes he could afford a fine stone house on a quieter street, but his meagre earnings barely cover rent and food for his brood. He also fears drawing the attention of the ruthless tax collector or running afoul of the guild. So he soldiers on, finding his few joys in a stolen embrace with Joan or a brief twilight walk along the twinkling Thames. A threadbare existence, to be sure, but still preferable to the squalid misery of London's vilest quarters, where even these slim comforts are but a dream. As we've seen, life in medieval cities and towns was often nasty, brutish and short. But for those seeking to escape the squalor and strife, options were limited. Some fled to remote monasteries, seeking solace in a life of quiet contemplation and prayer. Imagine you are a weary traveller, approaching one such monastery perched precariously on a windswept cliff. As you draw closer, you see the old stone walls pitted and worn by centuries of harsh weather. A few black-robed monks toil silently in the meagre garden plots, eking what sustenance they can from the thin, rocky soil. You are greeted at the gate by the abbot, a severe-looking man with a heavily lined face and piercing eyes. He welcomes you, as the rule of St. Benedict demands hospitality for all visitors. But you sense there is little warmth in his words. Life here is about discipline, deprivation, and duty, not comfort or companionship. The abbot leads you into the heart of the monastery, a world of cold stone, dark corridors, and flickering candles. Solemn plainchant echoes hauntingly through the cavernous chapel as the monks gather for vespers. In the refectory, you are served a meagre meal of thin gruel and hard bread in total silence. Even idle chatter is harshly forbidden. As the sun sets over the bleak cliffs and the sea mist rolls in, you retire to the guest house, really more of a dank cell with a straw pallet for a bed. Shivering in the gloom, you marvel at the fortitude required to endure such an austere existence day after day, year after year. What conviction or desperation could compel someone to such self-denial? One man whom might know is Brother Adelmo. At nearly 70 winters, he is the oldest monk in the abbey. His back is bent from decades of labour in the scriptorium, meticulously copying and illuminating manuscripts. His eyes are rheumy and his hands gnarled, but his mind is still as sharp as a well-honed quill. As you sit with him in a rare moment of rest, Adelmo recounts how he came to the monastery as a young man fleeing a broken heart and a life of sin. He dreamed of finding peace and purpose in service to God. But as the decades slowly passed in a blur of prayers, chores and solitude, doubts crept in. Had he truly been called to this life? Or was he simply running from his past? Now, with the end of his earthly existence looming, Adelmo grapples with unsettling questions that disturb his meditations. Did he waste the precious gift of life within these confining walls? Will the sacrifices and sufferings he endured for the glory of God be enough to earn his place in heaven? The old monk sighs deeply, the sound melding with the whistling wind outside. As you bid Adelmo goodbye and retire for the night, his words echo in your mind. A life of contemplation and devotion may bring some closer to the divine, But the hardships and isolation of places like this remote monastery also carried their own kind of quiet anguish. Even those who dedicated themselves to a higher calling were not immune to loneliness, doubt, and regret. Sleep is slow to come as you ponder the paradox of monastic life, a refuge from the world that could also become a prison of its own making. As your eyes finally close and the sound of distant waves lulls you to slumber, you dream of the nameless scribes like Adelmo, hunched over parchment by guttering candlelight through the centuries. Theirs was a cloistered existence we can scarcely imagine today, yet their diligence and faith ensured the survival of knowledge through the darkest of ages. But monasteries, as remote and restrictive as they could be, were far from the only challenging frontiers of the medieval world. For those dwelling in borderlands contested by rival kingdoms, life was a daily struggle for survival in the shadow of constant conflict. Picture a scene in the bleak marches of northern England, early in the 12th century. The morning fog clings low and chill over muddy fields as a haggard old woman emerges from a half-collapsed hovel. She is Morwenna, a widow of nearly 60 winters, who has seen more than her share of hardship and sorrow. Morwenna's eyes slowly survey what remains of her village, really just a handful of ramshackle huts clustered around the charred skeleton of a tiny chapel. The place never had a name. It was too small and insignificant to warrant one. Now, after the last attack by Scottish raiders, it barely qualifies as a hamlet at all. Picking her way through the churned-up mud and burnt debris, Morwenna heads to the meagre garden plot behind her hut. It's all that stands between her and starvation. As she bends to pull a few withered turnips from the hard ground, her mind drifts back to the fateful night a mere moon ago. She remembers the shouts of alarm, the pounding of hooves, and the flickering of torches in the darkness. The raiders came fast and merciless, throwing burning brands onto the thatch roofs and driving off the few scrawny sheep and cattle. Morwenna thinks of poor Edric the Reeve, cut down in a futile attempt to rouse a defence. His body still lies where it fell, hacked and bloating by the ruined chapel. Most of the survivors fled in the chaos, making for the relative safety of the walled town, a day's walk to the south. But Morwenna remains rooted to this miserable scrap of land, like one of her stubbornly tenacious turnips. Where else would she go? This hovel has been her home for 4 decades, ever since she came as a young bride to raise a family and eke out a living on the unforgiving frontier. She stayed through the bitter years after her husband was conscripted and never returned from some nameless skirmish to the north. She endured the winter her youngest son sickened and wasted away from the bloody flux. And she persisted even as most of her neighbours gave up and sought better prospects elsewhere. This land, hard as it is the only home Morwenna has ever known. So here she remains, a lonely old woman scratching out a meagre existence from an unyielding earth in a place constantly balanced on a knife's edge between survival and oblivion. As she straightens up painfully, clutching her few precious turnips, Morwenna gazes towards the leaden horizon. She can only hope the raiders, or the plague, or starvation hold off long enough for her to see another spring. Such was the precarious lot of so many in these lawless and unforgiving borderlands of medieval Europe. In the next scene, we'll voyage even further to the very edges of the known medieval world and discover the perils and miseries of life in a remote and poorly supplied colonial outpost. Brace yourself for a bleak journey across stormy seas to a destination promising untold suffering and despair for even the hardiest of souls. The dungeons of medieval castles were often vile and wretched places, the lowest levels of an already strictly hierarchical society. Damp, dark and claustrophobic, these subterranean chambers were reserved for only the most reviled members of the community. Traitors, heretics, debtors, and petty criminals, unfortunate enough to find themselves on the wrong side of the local lord's justice. For those condemned to languish in these dank holes, life was a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and despair. The stale air reeked of mold, rotting straw, and human waste. Vermin scurried in the shadows, feeding on scraps and occasionally the inmates themselves. The only light seeped in through tiny barred windows, if there were windows at all, and at night the darkness was absolute. The typical dungeon was little more than a stone vault, divided into cramped cells by rusting iron gates or heavy wooden doors. Manacles bolted to the walls restrained the most dangerous or troublesome prisoners. There was no furniture to speak of, perhaps a fetid pile of straw on the floor to serve as a makeshift bed. The jailers were as cold and unyielding as the walls, quick to wield the lash or withhold rations for the slightest provocation. One can scarcely imagine the anguish and alienation endured by the occupants of these dismal oubliettes. Ponder for a moment the story of Thomas, a young peasant farmer, wrongfully accused of poaching by a merciless nobleman. Ripped from the arms of his wife and infant son, Thomas was dragged in chains to the bowels of the castle, where he was thrown into a cramped, fetid cell, already occupied by two half-starved wretches. As the heavy door slammed shut, plunging him into stifling darkness, the horrible reality of his predicament began to sink in. The days stretched into weeks, each blurring into the next in an endless cycle of gnawing hunger, shivering cold, and fitful sleep on the damp stone floor. His cellmates, broken and emaciated, shared few words, having long ago exhausted their tales of misery and misfortune. Deprived of all human comforts and dignity, Thomas felt his mind begin to fray at the edges. He wept for his family, praying they would somehow find a way to survive without him. He cursed the nobleman who had condemned him, fantasizing about bloody revenge even as he grew weaker by the day. The worst was the knowledge that he would likely perish here in this filthy hole, never again to see the sun or breathe fresh air, his loved ones never knowing his fate. As the faint sounds of the castle above filtered through the stone, the clatter of dishes, snippets of muffled conversations, even the occasional snatch of music, Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the cruel capriciousness of life. How thin the line was between the lords and ladies in their fine silk and furs, and the miserable wretches rotting just beneath their feet. In the dungeon, stripped of all pretense, the stark inequality of the age was laid bare. Perhaps most soul-crushing of all was the sheer hopelessness of the prisoners' plight. With no recourse to appeal their sentence and no allies to plead their case, they could only pray for a miracle, or, more likely, an end to their suffering. Many lost their minds, raving in the darkness at phantoms and gibbering until merciful death claimed them. Others simply wasted away, their emaciated corpses lying for days before the guards bothered to drag them out. These scenes of misery and despair played out in castle dungeons across medieval Europe, from the Tower of London to the oubliettes of France and the Traki prison in Lithuania. While the specifics varied from place to place, the overarching cruelty and coldness was always the same, a reflection of the harshness and brutality of the age. For those who entered these dreadful dungeons, hope and humanity remained firmly shut outside. Of course, dungeons were not solely the province of castles and keeps. Many medieval cities and towns had their own prisons and jails, some hidden beneath government buildings or towering walls. These municipal dungeons could be every bit as horrid as their castle counterparts, overcrowded and underlit dens of appalling squalor. Particularly infamous were the dungeons of the Bastille in Paris, a looming fortress on the edge of the city that became a symbol of royal cruelty and excess. Its windowless cells, some of which flooded with each rainfall, crammed in political dissidents, free thinkers, and those who had simply offended the increasingly volatile French monarchy. Voltaire, the famous Enlightenment writer, spent nearly a year entombed in the Bastille under squalid conditions. Though his social status afforded him better treatment than the average prisoner, he still endured drafty, vermin-infested quarters, and the constant cries of tormented inmates. The experience left an indelible mark, and Voltaire's later writings seethed with contempt for the callous tyranny of French royal justice. In England, the Fleet prison became notorious for its horrendous conditions and systematic corruption. Ostensibly a debtor's prison, the Fleet was a filthy, decrepit labyrinth where inmates were shaken down for every penny by predatory wardens and subjected to all manner of abuse and extortion. For those who lacked the means to pay exorbitant fees for food, bedding, and other basic needs, life in the prison could be worse than death. The story of Jacob Mendez Solomons, an 18th century stockbroker who found himself imprisoned in the Fleet over a miscalculated debt, illustrates the everyday miseries faced by inmates. Unable to scrounge up the arbitrary sums demanded by the warden for food and a halfway decent cell, Solomons wasted away in the common side, a hellscape of open sewers, rampant disease, and unremitting hunger. Surviving on a few mouldy scraps snuck to him by a kindly rabbi, his health rapidly deteriorated. When his family was finally able to secure his release after several years, he emerged an emaciated, broken shell of a man, his once successful career in tatters. And so we see that the dungeons of the Middle Ages, whether in castles, keeps, or municipal jails, were all too often places of unimaginable suffering and despair. They imprisoned the body and crushed the spirit, stripping away dignity and sometimes sanity. That any emerged from these black pits at all is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. For those listening safely from the cocoon of a warm bed, it can be difficult to conceive of the depth of misery experienced by the countless souls condemned to waste away in medieval dungeons. As you drift off tonight, perhaps spare a thought for them, the forgotten, the forsaken, those who suffered in dark and filthy cells, clinging to the barest shreds of hope and humanity. Their struggles and their sorrows may be lost to time, but they need not be lost to memory. In learning their stories and pondering their plight, we keep a small candle burning for them in the present. And in so doing, we reaffirm the immense progress we've made and remind ourselves of the work still to be done in advancing human rights and dignity for all. With that, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. May your sleep be restful and your waking hours filled with gratitude and purpose. Until next time, this is your faithful history guide signing off. As we've seen, even the grandest medieval castles could be cold, dark, and uncomfortable places to live. But at least within those high walls, residents had a measure of security and stability. Not so for the people confined to the castle dungeons. These dank, filthy cells were reserved for the lowliest of prisoners, debtors, thieves, political rivals, and anyone else who drew the ire of the local lord. Escape was all but impossible. The thick stone walls were designed to keep prisoners in and block out any natural light. Iron bars, heavy wooden doors, and watchful guards ensured that those who entered the dungeon rarely left, except perhaps for a brief trip to the gallows. The skeletons discovered by modern archaeologists tell a grim story of what these prisoners endured. Malnutrition was common, as evidenced by bone deformities and tooth decay. Unhealed fractures point to frequent beatings by jailers. Journals from the time describe prisoners as wretched, miserable creatures, clothed in rags and covered in sores, their spirits utterly broken by the dehumanizing conditions. In some castles, the dungeon was little more than a deep pit or oubliette where prisoners were lowered on a rope and essentially left to starve in the dark. These unfortunate souls might be confined alongside the rotting corpses of previous victims, the very definition of a living nightmare. Other dungeons featured so-called torture chambers, where suspected traitors or blasphemers were subjected to brutal interrogations on devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or the Judas cradle under the sadistic eye of professional torturers. One account from 1385 tells the story of a French knight named Jean de Carouge, who was imprisoned by his rival Jacques le Gris in the dungeons of a small castle in Normandy. For weeks, Carouges was shackled to the walls in heavy irons, subsisting on meagre rations of stale bread and fetid water. Filthy rats as big as cats gnawed at his legs in the dark. According to the Chronicle, when Carouges was finally brought before his captor, he resembled a miserable sack of bones, scarcely recognizable as a man. Only his burning desire for vengeance sustained him. In a shocking turn of events, Carouges ultimately escaped his captivity just long enough to challenge Legris to a judicial duel, stabbing his former jailer to death before a crowd and washing away the stain on his honor. Most prisoners could only dream of such vindication. Their bleak and all too short lives ended in squalor, forgotten in some earthen hole. Perhaps the most famous dungeon prisoner of the Middle Ages was a mysterious figure known only as the Man in the Iron Mask. According to legend, this unidentified man was arrested in 1669 under orders from King Louis XIV of France himself. What terrible crime he committed has been lost to history. Some speculate he was the king's disgraced older brother, or perhaps the illegitimate child of a royal mistress. For reasons unknown, it was decreed that his identity should never be revealed. And so, this enigmatic prisoner spent over 3 decades confined in the dungeons of several French castles, always under heavy guard. Most bizarrely, he was forced to wear an iron mask at all times, even while eating or sleeping, to conceal his face from anyone he encountered. He was never referred to by name, only as prisoner number 64,389,000. While the true story may never be known, the mythic tale of the Man in the Iron Mask came to symbolize the mystery, dread, and capricious cruelty of medieval dungeons in the public imagination. Echoes of his story reverberate through the works of Voltaire and Alexandre Dumas. For centuries, the silent screams and strangled moans of dungeon prisoners haunted the thick castle walls like vengeful wraiths, fading into legend. Until modern times, these desperate voices from the past remained entombed in those long-abandoned vaults of stone and iron, their mute testimony to the darkest recesses of the medieval world. Yet as bleak as castle dungeons undoubtedly were, they were sadly just one of many terrible places a medieval peasant or foot soldier might find themselves trapped, hungry, and hopeless. When two medieval lords had a falling out over territory, wealth, or pride, it was always the lowliest in society who suffered most. In a typical siege, an invading army would surround their rival's castle and essentially camp outside the walls until the enemy surrendered, or everyone inside starved to death. The besieging force would construct crude fortifications to protect themselves and prevent aid or supplies from reaching the castle. Catapults and siege towers were assembled to assault the high walls from a distance. Tunnels might be dug to undermine the fortifications. This grim status quo could drag out for months or even years, with both sides growing increasingly desperate. The misery of daily life in these siege camps was difficult to overstate. Foraging and pillaging the surrounding countryside could only sustain the invaders for so long. Supply lines were notoriously unreliable. Food shortages and famine were a constant spectre. With so many soldiers crammed into a confined space alongside animals, refuse and the dead, disease spread like wildfire through the siege camps. Dysentery, cholera, and typhus cut down young warriors in their prime, rotting them from the inside out. There was little a medieval army physician could do but apply leeches and dispense prayers. An anonymous 14th century poem vividly describes the wretched scene. In the siege camp, life is hell. Knee-deep in filth and vomit dwell, pale, wasting troops with sunken eyes, whose sallow skin sloughs off in flies. Few sieges were as long or as dreadful as the infamous siege of Candia on the island of Crete, which dragged on for a staggering 21 years between 1648 to 1669. The Ottoman Empire sought to capture the strategic port city, a valuable Venetian outpost in the eastern Mediterranean. The walled settlement was subjected to near constant bombardment as the Ottomans slowly strangled it into submission. Over 70,000 Ottomans and nearly 40,000 Venetians ultimately lost their lives in the conflict, many felled by starvation or sickness rather than combat. Candia, modern-day Heraklion, finally fell to the Ottomans after a grueling final siege that lasted nearly 3 years. The city was reduced to rubble, its starved and scarred civilian survivors stumbling from the gates like walking ghosts. In many ways, the siege of Candia foreshadowed the grinding attrition and astronomical death tolls of modern trench warfare. For the lowly soldiers on the front lines of a medieval siege, there was little hope of glory or riches, only gnawing hunger, creeping disease, and the numbing monotony of camp life punctuated by occasional spasms of violence and mass death. Even if they survived, they might return home traumatized, crippled, or disfigured with little to show for their suffering. The unimaginable hardships of siege warfare left an indelible mark on the popular memory of the Middle Ages. In 1874, nearly 200 years after the last great siege of the period, the Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky penned his Pictures at an exhibition. The thundering and dissonant 10th movement, titled The Hut on Hen's Legs, Baba Yaga, was directly inspired by the legend of an evil witch who feasted on the souls of doomed medieval soldiers. So while fairy tales may be filled with gallant knights and chivalrous heroes, the reality for the bulk of medieval soldiers was as dark and hellish as the deepest dungeon. The ugly pointlessness of their sacrifice has largely been scrubbed from our collective idea of the Middle Ages, but their bleak struggle deserves remembrance. And yet, my weary travellers, even the wretched lot of the common soldier paled in comparison to the very lowest of the low in medieval society. The serfs and slaves whose bondage and backbreaking labour made such ceaseless warfare possible in the first place, chained by the invisible shackles of the feudal system. Here is the continuation of the bedtime history script: the worst places to live during medieval times. Imagine, if you will, gazing out across an isolated frontier outpost as the sun sinks slowly over the horizon. A chill wind whips across the barren hills, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from distant settlements. This is life on the outer reaches of the medieval world, a hard, lonely, and often short existence. You see, for many poor souls, their lot in life was to man the watchtowers and forts far removed from the relative comforts and security of the cities and towns. Out here, on the borderlands between rival kingdoms or the edge of civilization itself, one was at the mercy of not only the harsh elements, but also the cruelty and caprice of mankind. Consider the tale of Alric, a battle-scarred mercenary who has seen more than his share of violence and tragedy. As a young man, Alric was conscripted into the army of a petty lord, more of a brigand than any true nobility. For years he fought for this brute, raiding villages and burning crops, all while watching his compatriots fall in the name of greed and ambition. But what choice did he have? It was the soldier's life or the beggar's bowl. Now, with his best years behind him, Alric finds himself stationed in a crumbling fort, his task to keep watch for the very same raiders and bandits he once rode with. The irony is not lost on him as he stares out across the desolate hills, searching for any sign of trouble. But he takes his duties seriously, for he knows all too well the suffering that can be unleashed upon the innocent. Life here on the borderlands is a far cry from the pageantry and glory promised to young men who take up the sword and shield. The days are long, the rations meagre, and the company rough. Alric has seen more than one fresh-faced recruit, filled with dreams of valor and riches, broken by the grim reality of this posting. Some desert, fleeing into the night, never to be seen again. Others simply withdraw into themselves, their eyes haunted by the things they've witnessed. For Alric, there is a certain grim camaraderie amongst the men he serves with. They are all survivors in their own way, clinging to whatever shreds of humanity they have left. In the evenings, huddled around the meagre fire, they swap stories of past battles and fallen comrades, their laughter tinged with the gallows humour of those who live each day knowing it could be their last. And yet, even amidst the bleakness, there are moments of surprising beauty and grace. The way the morning mist clings to the hillsides, shrouding the land in an ethereal glow. The unexpected kindness of a local herder, offering a portion of his meagre provisions to the weary soldiers. The haunting strains of a minstrel's lute, drifting up from the valley below, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. But such moments are fleeting, and the harsh realities of life on the borderlands always reassert themselves. There are the constant raids and skirmishes, the clash of steel on steel and the cries of the wounded and dying. There is the tedium of endless watchers, staring out into the darkness, always alert for the first signs of danger. And there is the gnawing knowledge that one misstep, one moment of inattention, could mean the difference between life and death. For Alric, this life has taken its toll. His body bears the scars of 100 battles, his mind the weight of countless horrors witnessed. He knows that he will likely meet his end out here, on some nameless patch of blood-soaked earth, far from the home and family he barely remembers. And yet, he soldiers on, for duty, for honor, and for the slim hope that someday, somehow, he will find a measure of peace. As the last light of the day fades and the stars begin to emerge, Alric clambers up to his post atop the weathered ramparts. Pulling his cloak tight against the night chill, he settles in for another long watch. His eyes scan the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. His ears strain for the telltale sounds of an approaching enemy. It's a lonely vigil, but one he knows he must keep. For out here, on the edge of the map, there are no guarantees, no certainties. Only the knowledge that each new dawn brings with it both danger and the chance to see another sunset. Yes, life on the medieval borderlands was not for the faint of heart. It took a special kind of grit, a unique blend of resilience and resignation to endure such an existence. And yet, for men like Alric, it was the only life they knew. They were the watchers on the walls, the guardians in the night, the unsung heroes who stood between civilization and the chaos that threatened to engulf it. So, as you drift off to sleep, safe and warm in your modern bed, spare a thought for those like Alric, the forgotten souls who manned the ramparts and walked the lonely roads of the medieval frontier. Their struggles, their sacrifices, their small acts of courage and compassion, these are the threads that make up the tapestry of our shared history. And in honouring their memory, we keep alive the flame of human resilience that has carried us through the darkest of times and into the light of a new day. But the borderlands were not the only places where life was harsh and unforgiving in the medieval world. For those who took to the seas, seeking fortune or adventure in distant lands, an even more perilous existence awaited. The journey to the farthest reaches of the known world was long and fraught with danger, and those who survived to reach the colonies often found that the reality of life there was far from the promises of riches and glory. Imagine you are a young man named John, born into a poor family in the bustling port city of Bristol. All your life, you've heard tales of the New World, a land of endless opportunity, where a man can make his fortune and rise above his station. Seduced by these stories, you sign on as a labourer with a company of settlers bound for the distant shores of the Americas. The voyage is hell, For weeks on end, you are crammed into the dark, damp hold of the ship, surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and the groans of the seasick. The food is meagre and rotten, the water brackish and foul. Many of your fellow passengers succumb to disease or despair, their bodies unceremoniously consigned to the depths. By the time you finally make landfall, you are a shadow of your former self, weakened by hunger and illness. But the true ordeal is only beginning. The colony you find yourself in is a far cry from the paradise you were promised. The settlement is little more than a collection of ramshackle huts, surrounded by a hostile wilderness. The indigenous people, far from welcoming the newcomers, view them with suspicion and hostility, and with good reason, for the colonists often resort to violence and theft to sustain themselves. Life in the colony is a constant struggle against the elements, disease, and desperation. The work is backbreaking, the conditions squalid. Many of the settlers, unprepared for the rigors of this new life, quickly succumb to malnutrition, exhaustion, or the myriad illnesses that stalk the camp. You watch as your comrades die off one by one, their dreams of riches and glory shattered on the unforgiving shores of this new world. And yet, even in the midst of such misery, there are those who prosper. The leaders of the colony, the men who brought you here with their grandiose visions, seem to thrive on the suffering of others. They live in relative comfort, their huts larger and better provisioned, while the rest toil and starve. They enforce their rule with an iron fist, meting out harsh punishments for the slightest infractions. In this lawless place, their word is the only law. For you, John, each day is a test of endurance and will. You rise with the sun to tend the meager crops, your hands blistered and bleeding from the unaccustomed labor. You forage in the woods for anything edible to supplement the dwindling rations, always alert for the sound of hostile tribesmen or prowling predators. At night, huddled in your drafty shack, you dream of home, of the bustling streets of Bristol, the warmth of your mother's hearth, the companionship of friends and family. They seem like distant memories now, fading with each passing day. And yet, despite the hardships, you persevere. There is a stubborn streak in you, a refusal to surrender to despair. You find solace in the small moments of beauty and grace that punctuate the bleakness. The way the morning mist clings to the trees, the unexpected kindness of a fellow settler sharing their meager rations, the haunting strains of a song from home, sung softly around the evening fire. These moments remind you of your humanity, of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of even the most daunting adversity. As the weeks turn into months, and the months into years, you find yourself changed by this place, this life. Your hands are calloused now, your skin weathered by sun and wind. You've learned to hunt and trap, to navigate the dense forests and read the signs of the seasons. And though you still dream of home, a part of you has grown attached to this wild, untamed land, to the freedom and the challenges it represents. For better or worse, this is your life now. You are a survivor, a pioneer, a man forged in the crucible of the new world. Your story, John, is the story of countless others who ventured into the unknown, driven by hope, desperation, or sheer stubborn will. It is a story of suffering and sacrifice, of courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. And it is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, in the most God-forsaken corners of the earth, the human spirit endures. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to those distant shores, to the lonely outposts and struggling settlements that dotted the fringes of the known world. Imagine the faces of the men and women who lived and died there, their dreams and fears, their moments of triumph and despair. In their stories, we find echoes of our own struggles and aspirations. reminders of the indomitable will that has carried our species through the ages. And so, as the night closes in and the world grows still, take comfort in the knowledge that you are the beneficiary of their sacrifices, the inheritor of their resilient spirit. In the warmth and safety of your bed, in the soft glow of the modern world, their legacy lives on, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart to hope, to dream, and to persevere against all odds. Rest easy now, and let their stories be the stuff of your dreams. Tales of a time long past, but forever woven into the fabric of who we are. But the hardships of the medieval world were not confined to distant outposts and frontier settlements. Even within the heart of civilization, in the grand castles and fortified manors that dotted the landscape, life could be harsh, unforgiving, and rife with danger. Consider the tale of young Eleanor, a scullery maid in the service of a powerful feudal lord. Hers is a life of endless toil and drudgery, her days spent scrubbing pots, hauling water, and stoking the great fires of the castle kitchen. From before dawn until long into the night, she labours under the watchful eye of the head cook, a tyrannical woman known for her quick temper and heavy hand. For Eleanor, the castle is a world unto itself, a labyrinthine stone edifice filled with dark corridors, draughty halls, and cramped windowless servants' quarters. She navigates this gloomy realm with the sure-footedness of one born to servitude, her bare feet calloused from the cold flagstones, her hands chapped and raw from endless immersion in hot water and harsh lye soap. Life in the scullery is a far cry from the glittering world of the nobles who inhabit the castle's upper reaches. While they feast on rich meats, fine wines, and delicate pastries, Eleanor and her fellow servants subsist on a meagre diet of stale bread, thin gruel, and whatever scraps can be scavenged from the nobles' plates. While they sleep on soft feather beds, swaddled in furs and fine linens, the servants huddle together on pallets of straw, shivering beneath thin, patched blankets. And yet, for all the hardships, there is a certain camaraderie among the castle's serving class. In the rare moments of rest between their duties, they gather in the kitchen or the courtyards to share stories, gossip, and dreams of a better life. Eleanor finds solace in these moments, in the laughter and tears of her fellow servants, in the knowledge that she is not alone in her struggles. But even these fleeting respites are tainted by the ever-present spectre of danger. For life in a medieval castle was fraught with perils, both seen and unseen. There were the constant threats of fire, disease, and siege, the looming possibility of invasion or upheaval. And there were the more intimate dangers, the whims and cruelties of the nobles, the risk of abuse or exploitation at the hands of those with power over you. Eleanor has seen what can happen to a serving girl who catches the eye of a lustful lord or a jealous lady. She has heard the whispered stories of those who disappeared in the night, never to be seen again. And she lives with the constant fear that one day her own fate may hang in the balance of a noble's passing fancy or a moment's careless transgression. In this world, a servant's life is cheap, their well-being dependent on the whims of their betters. Eleanor knows that she must tread carefully, keep her head down and her thoughts guarded. She has learned to read the subtle currents of power and influence that flow through the castle, to navigate the treacherous waters of feudal politics with a deft and cautious hand. And yet, even amidst the darkness and the danger, Eleanor dreams of a different life. In the quiet moments before sleep claims her, she imagines a world beyond the castle walls, a world of freedom and possibility where she might make her own way, shape her own destiny. She clings to these dreams like a talisman, a secret fire burning in her heart, fueling her through the long, cold nights and the endless days of toil. For Eleanor, as for so many of the forgotten souls who toiled in the great houses of the medieval world, Life was a constant struggle, a battle against the elements, against the cruelties of fate and the whims of those with power over them. And yet, in their resilience, their endurance, their stubborn refusal to surrender to despair, they embodied the very essence of the human spirit, that indomitable will to survive, to hope, and to dream of a better tomorrow. As you drift off to sleep, let your thoughts linger on the life of young Eleanor, on the courage and the quiet dignity with which she faced the trials of her existence. In her story, and in the stories of countless others like her, we find a reminder of the strength that lies within us all, the capacity to endure, to persevere, and to find light in even the darkest of places. So rest now, and let the tales of the past be the fabric of your dreams. In the struggles and the triumphs of those who came before, we find the seeds of our own resilience, the echoes of our own indomitable spirit. And in the quiet of the night, as the world slips away and the realm of dreams takes hold, we honor their memory and draw strength from their enduring legacy. But the hardships of medieval life were not confined to the realm of the living. For those unfortunate souls who ran afoul of the law, or the whims of the powerful, an even darker fate awaited, the dank, dismal world of the dungeon. Imagine, if you will, the plight of a man named Thomas, a simple peasant farmer wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. Dragged from his fields and his family, Thomas finds himself thrown into a cramped, fetid cell, deep in the bowels of his lord's castle. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, he is at the mercy of his jailers, cruel, corrupt men who delight in the suffering of their charges. The conditions in the dungeon are horrific. The air is thick with the stench of human misery, the reek of unwashed bodies, the sickly sweet smell of infection and disease. The walls are slick with moisture, the floors covered in a layer of filth and grime. Vermin scurry in the shadows, feeding on the meagre scraps left by the prisoners, their skittering and squeaking a constant reminder of the degradation of this place. For Thomas, each day is a waking nightmare. The guards, when they remember to feed him at all, toss him mouldy bread and fetid water, barely enough to sustain life. They take perverse pleasure in tormenting him, in finding new ways to break his spirit and his will. They beat him, starve him, subject him to unspeakable humiliations, all in the name of extracting a confession for a crime he did not commit. And yet, even in the depths of his despair, Thomas clings to his innocence, to the belief that somehow, some way, justice will prevail. He prays fervently in the darkness, his whispered pleas echoing off the dank stone walls. He dreams of his wife, Anne. As we delve deeper into the dark annals of medieval history, we come to perhaps the most feared and dreaded of all places, the dungeons. These were not mere prisons for holding criminals awaiting trial or sentencing. No, the dungeons of the Middle Ages were horrific places of suffering, despair, and often cruel, arbitrary punishment at the whims of the powerful. Imagine, if you will, descending a narrow, slippery stone staircase deep beneath a towering castle. The air grows colder and danker with each step, down into the bowels of the earth. The only light is the flickering glow of torches, casting eerie dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The stench of mold, decay, and human misery thickens, making it hard to breathe. At the bottom, a heavy iron-bound door creaks open and you enter a claustrophobic, dimly lit chamber. The floor is packed dirt, cold and damp, scattered with mouldering straw. Filthy, haggard prisoners are shackled to the walls, huddled in small groups or curled up alone in the fetal position. Some moan pitifully or mutter incoherently. Others just stare blankly, seemingly devoid of hope. This is daily existence for the wretched souls condemned to the dungeons. Some are imprisoned for crimes like theft, assault, or rape. But many others are victims of political rivalries, religious persecution, or just being on the wrong side of someone in power. Innocence means little here. Justice is an illusion. One man slumped against the far wall is Edric, a simple farmer who ran afoul of the local lord over a land dispute. Edric had the audacity to protest when the nobleman's hunting party trampled his crops and slaughtered his livestock. For his insolence, the hapless farmer was dragged from his family and tossed into the dungeons to rot. That was 3 long years ago. Edric is now a shell of a man, his skin sallow and hanging loosely on his bones, his once bright eyes dulled by hopelessness. The jailers, when they bother to come, bring only a few mouldy scraps of bread and a filthy jug of water each day. Many prisoners simply stop eating, preferring to embrace the release of death. But physical privation is not the only torment inflicted on the dungeon's residents. The notorious jailer, a hulking brute named Oswald, is known for his cruel streak and twisted creativity in extracting confessions or just indulging his own sadistic impulses. And his toolbox is a stuff of nightmares. Oswald takes special pleasure in working over new prisoners. He relishes their terrified shrieks as he introduces them to his grim array of devices: the thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden, the rack. Even the threat of these implements is often enough to shatter the spirit and induce babbling compliance to any accusation. Few prisoners in Oswald's domain dare to dream of freedom or deliverance. Most sink into a grim resignation, their only hope that death comes quickly. When the cell door slams shut behind you, it is as if the world above ceases to exist. There is only the never-ending nightmare of the dungeon. But even in the depths of despair, the resilience of the human spirit sometimes endures. Prisoners tell each other stories to hold on to fading memories of the outside world. They share precious crumbs of food and sips of water. They whisper prayers and words of encouragement. Edric has found solace in a most unexpected way. In a corner of his cell, behind a loose stone, he found a scrap of charcoal. And in the fleeting light of the guttering torches, he has begun to sketch on the walls. Crude, stick-like figures at first, but with practice, his pictures have grown increasingly detailed and evocative. He draws scenes from his past life: his modest cottage, his wife's smiling face, his children playing in the fields. He sketches his fellow prisoners, capturing their haunted visages. He even depicts Oswald as a snarling, demon-like figure. It is as if, by putting their reality to paper, he can somehow master it. His artwork doesn't go unnoticed. Other prisoners beg Edric to sketch their loved ones from their descriptions, clinging to these fragile images as talismans against the darkness. Even some of the guards are moved by his work, and they repay him by smuggling in extra candles, charcoal, and, on occasion, scraps of meat. For Edric, his art has become a lifeline, a way to preserve his sanity and humanity in the face of overwhelming degradation. He may die here in this hellish pit, but a part of him, the part that creates, that imagines, that sees beauty even in the darkest places, that part will live on, undefeated. The dungeons of the Middle Ages broke the bodies and crushed the souls of countless unfortunates. They were, in many ways, a concentrated microcosm of the cruelty, injustice, and oppression that shadowed much of medieval life for the powerless. But as Edric's story reminds us, there were also glimmers of light amidst the darkness. The endurance of hope, the solidarity of shared suffering, the determination to preserve one's dignity and spirit against all odds. These too were part of the human experience, even in the worst of times and places. As we emerge from the depths of the dungeons back into the light of day, it is worth reflecting on the incredible resilience and unquenchable spirit of our ancestors, who endured such harrowing conditions. Their struggles and triumphs, however small or forgotten by history, are a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. So as you drift off to sleep in the comfort of your modern bed, spare a thought for those who came before, who survived the worst that medieval life could throw at them. And perhaps in your dreams, you'll sketch a brighter picture for them, one where hope and humanity finally overcome the darkness. As we delve deeper into the grim realities of medieval life, it's important to remember that even those who occupied positions of power and privilege were not immune to the dangers and hardships of the time. In fact, some of the most miserable existences could be found within the cold stone walls of Europe's castles and fortresses. Take, for example, the story of young William, a lowly servant toiling away in the scullery of a dank, draughty castle in the 13th century England. William's days were an endless cycle of back-breaking labour, scrubbing grimy pots, hauling heavy buckets of water, and stoking the fires of the massive kitchen hearths. From before sunrise until well past sunset, he was at the beck and call of the tyrannical head cook, a short-tempered man prone to doling out swift and painful punishments for even the smallest of mistakes. Life in the castle was a far cry from the romanticised tales of chivalry and courtly love that William had heard as a child. The living quarters were cramped, cold, and perpetually damp, with narrow windows that let in little light and even less fresh air. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and the constant noise and bustle of the castle made it nearly impossible to find a moment's peace. But perhaps even more oppressive than the physical discomforts was the rigidly hierarchical society that governed every aspect of castle life. As a lowly servant, William was at the very bottom of the pecking order, subject to the whims and abuses of not only the head cook, but also the kitchen maids, the scullions, and even the castle dogs. He quickly learned to keep his head down, his mouth shut, and to never, ever question the orders of his superiors. Despite the hardships, William found small moments of solace in the camaraderie of his fellow servants. In the precious few hours between their duties, they would gather in the warmth of the kitchen, sharing meagre meals and swapping stories of their lives before coming to the castle. For many, it was the only family they had ever known. But even these small comforts could not ease the gnawing hunger in William's belly or the ache in his bones from long hours of toil. He dreamed of a better life, of a world beyond the castle walls where he could be his own master and live by his own rules. But deep down, he knew that such dreams were foolish. For a lowly servant in a medieval castle, there was no escape from the grim realities of daily life. As the years passed, William watched as the world outside the castle walls seemed to grow even more dangerous and unpredictable. Tales of war, plague, and famine filtered in from the countryside, and the castle became increasingly fortified against the threat of attack. The once bustling courtyard was now a grim and foreboding place, patrolled by heavily armed guards and filled with the clatter of weapons and armour. Even the lords and ladies of the castle were not immune to the pervasive sense of fear and unease. They retreated ever deeper into their private chambers, surrounding themselves with loyal retainers and heavily armed guards. The great hall, once a place of feasting and merriment, now stood empty and echoing, a testament to the dark times that had befallen the land. For William, life in the castle had become a waking nightmare, a never-ending cycle of toil and hardship with no hope of escape. But even in his darkest moments, he clung to the small sparks of humanity that still flickered in the hearts of those around him. The kindness of a fellow servant, the fleeting smile of a kitchen maid, the gentle nuzzle of a castle dog. These were the things that kept him going, the tiny glimmers of light in an otherwise bleak and unforgiving world. As the castle walls seemed to close in around him, William could not help but wonder what lay beyond the horizon. Were there lands untouched by the ravages of war and disease, places where a man could live free and unencumbered by the chains of servitude? He knew that he would likely never find out, but still, the dream persisted, a tiny flame of hope in a world gone mad. Years turned into decades, and William grew old and grey within the castle walls. His once strong back now stooped from years of labour, his hands gnarled and scarred from countless burns and cuts. But even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp and clear, a testament to the indomitable human spirit that had sustained him through so many trials and tribulations. Looking back on his life, William could not help but feel a sense of profound sadness and regret. He had been born into a world that was not of his making, a world that had used him up and cast him aside like so much refuse. But even in his darkest moments, he had never lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered, his own humanity. For in the end, it was not the grand tales of kings and queens that would endure, but the small, everyday acts of kindness and compassion that made life worth living. The smile of a child, the touch of a loved one's hand, the warmth of a fire on a cold winter's night. These were the things that truly mattered, the things that would endure long after the castle walls had crumbled to dust. As William lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the faces of those he had come to know and love over the years, he could not help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. He had lived a hard life, a life of unimaginable hardship and suffering, but he had also known moments of joy and laughter, of love and companionship, and in the end, that was enough. With a final rattling breath, William closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, secure in the knowledge that he had lived a life worth living, even in the worst of times and the worst of places. And as his spirit drifted off into the great unknown, he could not help but smile at the thought of all the adventures that lay ahead, in this life and the next. For you see, dear listener, even in the darkest of times, there is always hope to be found, always a glimmer of light to guide us through the shadows. And it is in these moments of despair and hardship that we discover the true strength and resilience of the human spirit. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to reflect on the incredible journey that has brought you to this moment. The trials and tribulations you have faced, the moments of joy and sorrow that have shaped you into the person you are today. And know that no matter what challenges may lie ahead, you have the strength and the courage to face them head on, just as William did so many centuries ago. Rest now, dear listener, and let the gentle embrace of sleep carry you off to a world of dreams and possibilities. For tomorrow is a new day, full of new adventures and new opportunities to make your mark upon the world. And with a heart full of hope and a spirit full of courage, there is nothing you cannot achieve. Good night and sweet dreams. The next unfortunate soul we'll meet is a battle-hardened mercenary named Aldrich. Aldrich has seen more than his share of bloodshed and misery along the bleak borderlands between two warring kingdoms. For decades, this disputed frontier has been ravaged by constant raids, skirmishes, and power struggles between rival lords vying for control. The once fertile fields now lay burned and fallow, dotted with abandoned villages and the ruins of keeps destroyed in the fighting. Aldrich was born into this hard life, the son of a poor farmer turned soldier. From a young age, he learned how to wield a sword and sleep with one eye open, always alert for the sounds of approaching hoofbeats in the night. When their small village was put to the torch by a marauding army, Aldrich barely escaped with his life. His parents and sister weren't so lucky. On that terrible night, choking on smoke and cradling his dying father, the young man vowed to take revenge on those responsible. In the years that followed, Aldrich grew into a formidable warrior, hiring out his skills to whichever lord or warlord was willing to pay the most coin. He won renown for his courage on the battlefield and ruthlessness in hunting down the enemies of his patrons. But each gory victory and pile of silver only seemed to harden his heart further. The innocent, idealistic boy was long gone, replaced by a jaded, cynical man who trusted no one. Still, even a grizzled fighter like Aldrich was not immune to the hazards and hardships of life on the blood-soaked borderlands. He had lost count of the many friends and comrades in arms he had seen cut down over the years, their bodies left to bloat in the sun or be picked apart by carrion birds. He himself bore the scars of 100 desperate melees and ambushes, including a wicked gash down his sword arm that ended his days of wielding a blade. With his fighting career over, Aldrich took his stash of loot and retired to a crumbling stone tower overlooking a desolate valley, one of the few recognizable landmarks still standing amidst the border wastes. Here, alone with his fading memories and old battle wounds that ached when it rained, Aldrich waited out the last of his days. Gazing out over the war-torn landscape, he often wondered what it had all been for. All the blood spilled, lives ruined, homes destroyed. And for what? A few miles of burnt, useless borderland, constantly switching hands between one petty ruler and the next. As he sat wrapped in a moth-eaten cloak, taking a swig of sour wine from a dented tin cup, Aldrich reflected that there was no real victor to be found here, only victims. The true rulers were misery, brutality, and never-ending conflict itself. He had escaped the borderlands, but its dark legacy would forever haunt him. And somewhere out there, no doubt new orphans were being forged in the fires of destruction, ready to take up the sword and continue the cycles of violence as they always had. Such was the way of things in the lawless marches, where only the crows and worms profited from the follies of men. From one harrowing hinterland, we now set sail across the heaving seas to an equally inhospitable environment, the early colonial outposts clinging precariously to the edges of the known medieval world. Imagine a creaking, leaky wooden ship packed with desperate souls who have left their familiar lives behind, risking everything to seek their fortunes in a new world. After enduring months of storms, sickness, and dwindling supplies, they stagger ashore in a hostile wilderness, confronted by indigenous peoples understandably wary of the pale strangers invading their ancestral lands. One such luckless adventurer was a young man named John. The third son of a poor baker in London, John had grown up hearing tales of exotic new continents waiting to be claimed, teeming with gold and endless possibility for any man brave enough to seize the chance. Anything sounded better than a lifetime of kneading dough and fighting his brothers for morsels, so John leapt at the opportunity to join a colonial expedition as an indentured servant. 7 years' labour in exchange for his passage and a small parcel of virgin land. But as was so often the case, the reality awaiting the naive settlers stood in grim contrast to the grand promises that had lured them across the Atlantic. Instead of a new Eden overflowing with riches and resources, they found a harsh, unforgiving land of scorching summers, bone-chilling winters, and thick, disorienting forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The established colony they had been expecting was little more than a muddy square of ramshackle huts behind a flimsy wooden palisade. From the moment John staggered ashore, weak and blinking from the long confinement in the bowels of the ship, he was put to back-breaking labour, toiling from dawn to dusk to hack farmland from the dense woods. With each swing of the axe, he was assaulted by clouds of biting insects, and the constant fear of an ambush by the shadowy natives glimpsed skulking between the trees. It was a brutal initiation for a soft city dweller unused to such ceaseless grinding toil. As the weeks turned to months, life in the colony went from grim to dire. Precious seed stocks rotted in the humid weather, leaving the settlers with meagre crops insufficient to feed the swelling ranks of new arrivals. Dysentery, fever, and starvation began to take their toll, filling a growing cemetery on a lonely hill. Leaders who had proclaimed themselves governors and proprietors soon revealed themselves as little more than petty tyrants, hoarding dwindling supplies and ruthlessly putting down any hint of dissent among the increasingly desperate colonists. For John, the final straw came when he witnessed the colony's self-styled marshal cold-bloodedly execute a terrified native woman accused of stealing from the company's stores. shooting her in the back as she tried to flee with a sack of mouldy grain. The casual cruelty, the complete disregard for a human life, made John violently ill. In that moment, he knew this was not a society he wanted any part of. That night, John made a risky gambit and fled into the foreboding forest. At first, every snapping twig and flitting shadow made his heart race with visions of Indian warbands or pursuing soldiers. But as John pressed deeper into the sea of trees, a strange sense of peace and purpose began to settle over him. He may be alone in an alien world, but at least he was free, beholden to no man, able to meet whatever fate had in store for him on his own terms. With a few rusted tools and a small stash of seeds, John began the long, lonely work of forging a new life in the depths of the primeval forest. From one brutal outpost of colonial exploitation, we make our way to an institution synonymous with the worst excesses of medieval times, the castle dungeon. These dank, claustrophobic warrens were used to hold everyone from hardened criminals and enemy soldiers to political dissidents and the merely unlucky. Many never saw the light of day again, condemned to suffer and die in the dark, damp bowels of an uncaring fortress. Our next tale centers on one such unfortunate, a young woman named Elaine. A simple peasant from a village near a powerful lord's castle, Elaine lived a life of ceaseless drudgery, toiling from first light in the smoky confines of a peasant hovel, struggling to grow enough food on her family's meagre plot to pay the ever-increasing tithes and taxes demanded by the aristocracy. Like most, Elaine bore the injustice with weary resignation, until the day the Lord's men came to drag away her sickly younger sister, claiming she had been caught stealing a loaf of bread from the castle kitchens. When Elaine confronted the cruel steward, pleading for mercy on behalf of her sibling, the leering official made her a horrific offer. He would release the girl if Elaine took her place, offering her virtue to sate his twisted lusts. Elaine refused, unwilling to debase herself before such a monster. Enraged, the steward had her dragged down to the deepest, darkest dungeon and shackled to the filth-encrusted wall, vowing she would never again see the sun until she submitted to his desires. But Elaine's will was stronger than the steward anticipated. For week after week, she endured the gnawing hunger, the bone-numbing cold, the incessant drip of water, and scurrying of flea-bitten rats. Her world shrank to the few feet of fetid straw she huddled upon, and the meagre ration of maggoty bread and brackish water shoved through a slot in the solid oak door. In the suffocating darkness, time lost all meaning. She took to talking to the tiny baby rats, coaxing them to her with crumbs and giving them names like the children she now realized she would likely never have. The one thing that sustained Elaine through the endless monotony of misery was her anger, a hard, flinty core of defiance that the sadistic steward's frequent visits could not extinguish, no matter how he taunted and threatened her. She came to almost relish his rages, knowing that her refusal to break was the one weapon she had against her captors. Elaine took dark satisfaction, imagining the indignities and punishments she would inflict on the self-important lord and his toadies if she ever got the chance. A litany of pain that she turned over in her mind during the long hours alone in the dark. But as the weeks turned into months, and her cramped muscles wasted, and her skin turned ghostly pale, part of Elaine began to despair that chance would never come, that she would end her days a tattered bag of bones in this lightless hole, defiant to the last, but ultimately forgotten. Then came the night that distant shouts and clashing metal echoed dimly through the thick dungeon walls. The fortress was under attack. Whether they were brave rebels or simply a rival lord's army, Elaine neither knew nor cared. It was the opportunity she had dreamed of. When the battle sounds finally faded and a new, deeper silence fell over the castle, Elaine began to shout and bang her rusted chains against the door with all her fading strength. Most of the guards had likely been called away to defend the walls. Perhaps, just perhaps, there would be no one to hear. She kept up the cacophony for what felt like hours until her voice gave out and her wrists were slick with blood. And then, just as despair began to close in again, Elaine heard the scraping sound of a heavy iron key turning in the lock. From one dungeon's desolate depths, we emerge blinking into the thin light of an equally dismal environment, the sprawling, filthy encampment of an army laying siege to an enemy stronghold. The medieval era was one of near-constant warfare, as rival kings, lords, and religious factions vied for power and territory. When an attacking force met a castle or fortified city that refused to surrender, they would encamp around it, choking off all supply lines and escape routes and settling in for the long, grim business of starving out the defenders. These sieges could last anywhere from a few weeks to many months, sometimes even years in the case of great cities like Constantinople or Jerusalem. For the soldiers squatting in the muddy fields and shivering forests surrounding the battlements, siege warfare was an excruciating test of endurance and will. With little shelter from the elements beyond what crude lean-tos and trenches they could dig, besieging troops suffered terribly from exposure, disease, and sheer crushing boredom. One man all too familiar with such trials was a grizzled old sergeant named Ivo. A peasant conscript from Lombardy, Ivo had served more than 20 years in a condottiero company, the private mercenary armies hired out by Italian city-states to do their fighting. In that time, he had seen more sieges than he could remember, squatting miserably in every kind of weather, as he waited for the lords to finish their business of haggling and threatening, so he could get back to the bloody but blessedly quick work of actual combat. This latest siege seemed particularly cursed. The army had arrived in high summer, expecting to intimidate the small castle into a swift surrender. But behind its thick stone walls, the defenders proved stubborn, forcing the besiegers to dig in for the long haul. As the weeks dragged on, the camp sunk into a morass of muck, churned up by thousands of marching feet and the hooves of destriers. With latrine trenches overflowing, and more men arriving every day, cramming into the ramshackle shelters elbow to elbow, pestilence soon followed. First, it was camp fever, then flux. Men woke sniffling in the morning and were cold in their bedrolls by nightfall, faces swollen and yellowed with pustulant carbuncles. Ivo stopped learning the names of the fresh-faced recruits after the first month, knowing most would be in the burial pits soon enough. Despite his long experience, the stench of the contagion tents, the moaning and wailing, the buzzing of corpse flies, still turned the old soldier's stomach. But illness was not the only danger in the siege trenches. The defenders soon turned to harassing the encampment with midnight raids and showers of arrows and fiery debris launched from their lofty battlements. Ivo lost count of how many sleeping men he had seen, dragged screaming into the darkness, after creeping sappers emerged from secret tunnels, or charred black by flaming naphtha spilled from the sky. He himself now carried a thick knot of scar tissue on his thigh, where a barbed crossbow bolt had torn through muscle and sinew to the bone. Through it all, the siege dragged interminably on, with no sign of resolution. The suffering soldiers took to dark mutterings against their commander, a foppish young noble who directed the sorry affair from a lavish tent far behind the lines. There was talk of desertion, even open mutiny. Only harsh punishment details and meagre doles of rotting supplies held back open rebellion for now. As another sodden, miserable autumn loomed, Ivo kept his head down and his cracked lips sealed. He had long ago lost any illusions of glory or honor. His only concern now was surviving to draw his next pitiful payment. At least the siege offered one cold comfort, Ivo mused darkly as he drew his ragged blanket closer in the driving rain. If he was cursed to endure this slow, lingering hell, he could take some grim satisfaction, knowing his noble masters and their pretty castle-dwelling foes were suffering the same. Hunger, disease, and exposure were the great equalizers, implacable foes that ground both gilded knight and lowly pikeman alike into the self-same muck and misery. In the end, sieges revealed the ultimate truth of war, that pain was the only victor and death the only lasting peace. As our dreary tour through the worst places of the medieval world draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what we've witnessed. From the fetid alleys of teeming cities to the bloody borderlands, dank dungeons to pestilential siege camps, each of these environments we've explored was defined by profound hardship, cruelty, and suffering. They remind us that for the vast majority of people, life in the Middle Ages was often nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, even in these grim places humanity endured, found moments of grace, courage, or grim resolve. The people we met along the way, John seeking a new life in the new world, Elaine defiant in the depths of the dungeons, they speak to a resilience of spirit that can never be fully extinguished, even in the grimmest of circumstances. As for Ivo, Aldrich, and the other soldiers and mercenaries, well, there have always been hard men willing to eke out a living on the ragged, violent edges of society. Their cold, pragmatic outlook is itself a kind of survival mechanism. But as we bid goodnight to these shadow-cloaked figures from our past, we should count ourselves fortunate to enjoy comforts they couldn't imagine. Not only the physical trappings of modern life, but the hard-won ideas of justice, dignity, and basic human rights that most medieval folk were denied. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your warm bed, under your sturdy roof, take a moment to appreciate your blessings. The world, for all its modern troubles, is in many ways a kinder, more humane place today than the medieval souls we met tonight could have ever dreamed. And if some night your cushioned slumber is disturbed by dark dreams of plague pits or dungeon chains, or you find yourself contemplating the fragility of civilized life and all we take for granted, spare a thought for those who came before us and the hardscrabble lives they endured. Because it is only by remembering and reckoning with the darkness of the past that we can truly appreciate the light and possibility of our present. The medieval world built the foundations of our own, for good and for ill. By confronting the worst of what was, we are better equipped to imagine and work towards the best of what might be. But for now, on behalf of John, Elaine, Ivo, myself, and all the other shades of history you've met in this humble series, we bid you good night and pleasant dreams in your corner of a world those who came before could scarcely envision. The medieval era may have been a time of great suffering and strife, but it was also an age of endurance, ingenuity, and so we turn our gaze now to the remote and often neglected corners of the medieval world, the distant frontier outposts and colonies on the fringes of civilization. Life in these far-flung settlements could be every bit as challenging and unforgiving as in the overcrowded cities and disease-ravaged towns we've explored thus far. Imagine for a moment that you are a settler, filled with dreams of opportunity and adventure, boarding a ship bound for a newly established colony on a distant shore. The journey itself is long and perilous, with threats of storms, pirates, and deadly illnesses lurking at every turn. Many perish before ever laying eyes on their destination. But let us say you are one of the lucky ones who survives the harrowing voyage. As you step foot onto the sandy beach of this brave new world, what awaits you? At first glance, the untamed wilderness and twinkling blue waters may seem a tropical paradise compared to the filthy cities you left behind. Swaying palm trees, raucous birds, and intriguing new foods hint at the promise of a fresh start in a land of plenty. But you soon learn that life in the colonies is no idyllic retreat. The oppressive heat saps your energy, Vicious insects leave you covered in painful welts, and strange new diseases stalk the makeshift settlement. The colonial authorities, desperate to impose order and extract maximum productivity from the new territory, rule with an iron fist. Fail to meet your work quotas, and you may find yourself on the receiving end of the whip, or locked in a sweltering wooden cage under the blistering sun. Step out of line, or anger the wrong official, and you could be cast out of the colony entirely, left to fend for yourself in the untamed jungle. For the indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands you now occupy, your arrival heralds an even more dire fate. Lacking immunity to diseases like smallpox and measles, native populations are decimated by epidemics spread from the unsanitary ships and filthy sailors. Enslavement, forced relocation, and genocide become terrible features of colonial life, as greed and bigotry justify increasingly brutal policies. The societal bonds and ancient traditions that sustained these unique cultures for generations swiftly crumble in the face of this onslaught. Through it all, the naive dreams that propelled so many across the ocean to this harsh new reality swiftly evaporate. Let us consider the tale of Miguel, a young man from a poor Iberian village who eagerly signed up for a colonial expedition, lured by the promise of land and riches. The recruiters spun visions of gem-encrusted streams, trees laden with exotic delicacies, and docile natives eager to share their bounty with industrious settlers. It all sounded too good to be true, and of course, it was. From the moment his dry and cracked feet hit the beach, Miguel was put to back-breaking labor, rising before dawn to hack through the dense foliage and build rudimentary shelters under the merciless sun. The mosquitoes feasted on his blood, leaving him shivering with fever, while his stomach rebelled against the strange foreign foods. There were no streets of gold to be found, no spices growing from the ground to make him rich overnight. His overlords cared only about how many trees he could fell in a day, how much gold he could extract from the streams to fill their coffers back home. Any resistors were dealt with brutally and publicly to send a message to the rest. Miguel watched in horror as a defiant young man from his ship was flogged until the skin peeled off his back, then left to die in the stocks as a warning to others. As the long, hot days dragged into months, Miguel's youthful optimism withered along with his body. When a tender in his leg became inflamed and then necrotic after an insect bite, the colony's harsh leaders pushed him to keep working, lest he forfeit his already paltry share of imagined future riches. By the time the leg turned black and the fever took hold of his brain, it was too late. Like so many others, he perished an ocean away from the family who had hoped his colonial venture would be their ticket out of poverty. Miguel's story was all too common in lawless colonies like this one, just another broken body ground under the wheels of empire and greed. Life in these tenuous outposts balanced on a precarious knife's edge, with settlers like him caught between the ruthless whims of the authorities and the perils of an unforgiving new land. Behind the triumphant tales of conquest and untold riches lay a darker reality of abuse, disease, and shattered dreams. So when you curl up in your soft, warm bed tonight, perhaps spare a thought for people like Miguel and the native islanders, whose lives were so brutally upended by colonial expansion. As your head sinks into your plush pillow, remember that you are among the fortunate who have never had to endure such trials. Let that gratitude lull you into a restful slumber as we leave the dismal colonies behind and continue our journey through the worst places to live in medieval times. Our next destination shall take us to an altogether different sort of isolated, regimented settlement, but one where the scourges of disease and oppression are no less keenly felt. We're going to venture now inside the remote stone walls of a secluded monastery perched high on a rugged, wind-whipped cliff. Life in these spiritual outposts could be every bit as demanding and Spartan as what we've witnessed in the colonies. albeit with a very different set of guiding principles. Monasteries occupied a unique and often contradictory place in medieval society. On one hand, they served as sanctuaries for spiritual contemplation, where men and women could dedicate their lives to prayer, scholarship, and service to their faith. The best-known orders took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing worldly possessions and pleasures in pursuit of divine grace. At their finest, they offered a chance to transcend the brutish conditions of medieval life and connect with a higher purpose. But the reality inside these cloistered stone compounds was often far removed from the romantic ideal. Monks and nuns endured lives of grinding labor, strict discipline, and constant hardship. They rose before dawn for the first of many daily prayer services, huddled in unheated stone chapels to chant for hours on end. In between, they worked unceasingly to maintain their isolated communities, toiling in the fields, copying manuscripts, tending to the sick, all to ensure survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The rules governing monastic life were unwaveringly rigid. Vows of silence forbade frivolous speech for days or even years on end. Transgressions like tardiness, inattentiveness, or disrespect could earn brutal punishments, from stints in isolation to flaying with a whip. In a society of self-abnegation, there was little room for levity or leisure. Existence revolved around prayer, labor, and quiet suffering, all for the promise of eternal reward in the hereafter. Consider the case of Brother Alric, a studious young man who entered the monastery with dreams of devoting his life to scholarly pursuits. He had always felt like an outsider in his rough rural community, more at home among the dusty tomes and scrolls of the church library than behind a plough in the fields. The cloistered life, he believed, would provide an oasis of intellectual stimulation and spiritual growth, free from the distractions and vices of the outside world. At first, Alric reveled in his new environment. The murmur of hushed voices echoing in the vaulted chapel soothed his soul, while the meticulously maintained gardens and grounds bespoke a higher order and sense of purpose. He took to his duties in the scriptorium with relish, marveling at the opportunity to read precious texts and discuss the finer points of philosophy with his fellow initiates. However, as the long and lonely years wore on, Alric increasingly chafed against the stifling rigidity and austerity of monastic existence. While his mind yearned to soar free, his aging body ached from the unending labor and deprivations. The unvarying daily routine of prayer and toil blurred the lines between the seasons, until time itself seemed to dissolve into an indistinct haze of grey stone and muted suffering. As he watched his youthful comrades slowly stooped and hobbled by the burdens of this life, Alric found his once unshakable faith starting to falter. Lingering doubts crept into his prayers, nagging questions that could find no purchase within the ironclad orthodoxy of the order. With each passing year, the warm light that had once suffused his vision of God grew fainter and more remote, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that even the most fervent devotions could not ease. By the time he had ascended to a senior position within the order, Alric was a hollowed-out husk of the bright-eyed youth who had entered so eagerly all those decades ago. His skin had grown as translucent and brittle as the faded parchment he spent his days hunched over, while his eyes were milky with cataracts from straining to read by flickering candlelight. The higher purpose that had once seemed so tantalizingly close now felt like a mocking mirage, receding further with every painstaking step. Alric's tale is a testament to the harsh realities that could lurk beneath the placid surface of the monastic life. For every monk who found spiritual fulfillment in this austere and regimented world, there were others ground down by its relentless demands and privations. The very qualities that made the cloister a haven from the chaos and brutality of medieval society, the isolation, the rigid order, the all-consuming commitment, could also render it a kind of prison, a life sentence in the service of an increasingly elusive ideal. As you reflect on Alric's quiet despair, on the dreams and doubts slowly suffocated within those thick stone walls, remember once again how fortunate you are to lay your weary head in a place of warmth and comfort this night. Your soft mattress and gently billowing curtains are a world away from the hard pallets and bare cells that counted as luxury to the medieval monastic. The freedom to let your mind wander where it will as you drift off to sleep was a gift utterly denied to those dutiful souls, locked in an endless cycle of prayer and service until their very last breath. So as you feel yourself sliding gently now into the welcoming embrace of slumber, whisper a word of thanks into the still night air for the small mercies of your present life. Mercies that would seem like unimaginable riches to so many who came before, whether toiling in a distant colony, chanting in a drafty chapel, or facing any of the myriad other hardships that were part and parcel of the medieval experience. The final leg of our journey through this distant and often dismal era shall lead us to one of the grimmest destinations of all, a place where the stony austerity of the monastery meets the casual brutality of the lawless outpost. Prepare yourself now to descend into the dank and dismal depths of the medieval dungeon, where cruelty and despair fester in the shadows of indifferent power. In the centuries before the rise of formal prison systems, dungeons served as catch-all solutions for a society with little concept of humane confinement. Whether you were a captured enemy soldier, an accused heretic awaiting trial, a common thief, or simply a peasant who had offended the wrong noble, you might find yourself thrown into one of these reeking pits to endure all manner of torment and privation. The conditions in a typical dungeon were nothing short of hellish. Prisoners were crammed into filthy, lightless cells, with little more than a pile of fetid straw to sleep on, if they were lucky. Food and water were scarce, often used as tools of torture and control by sadistic jailers. Disease ran rampant in the close, damp quarters, with prisoners' wounds and sores left to fester and rot. The stench of bodily waste, sickness, and death hung heavy in the air, a miasma that seeped into everything and everyone. But as wretched as the physical conditions were, the psychological torment was often even worse. The screams of the tortured echoed endlessly through the stone corridors, a chilling reminder of the fate that could befall anyone at any moment. Prisoners might languish for years without learning the charges against them, let alone receiving any semblance of due process or trial. Those who displeased their captors could find themselves contorted in diabolic devices like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or the strappado, their bodies stretched and broken in service of the jailer's cruel whims. Consider the plight of a young woman named Maud, arrested on suspicion of witchcraft by the soldiers of the local fiefdom. A simple healing woman who tended to the sick with herbs and prayer, Maud made the mistake of spurning the advances of a minor noble who then accused her of bewitching him with her evil magic. She was dragged screaming from her small cottage and flung into the musty darkness of the castle dungeon, her pleas of innocence and mercy falling on deaf ears. In the days and weeks that followed, Maud endured an unrelenting nightmare of abuse and terror. Her jailers taunted her mercilessly, alternating promises of lenience in exchange for sexual favors, with vicious beatings that left her body a map of mottled bruises. They let her slowly starve and smolder with thirst, breaking her down inch by ruthless inch until she began to question her own hold on reality. When she still refused to confess to the imaginary crimes they had pinned on her, the torture escalated to new heights of inventive cruelty. She was stretched on the rack until her joints separated with wet pops and her tendons snapped like frayed lute strings. Thumbscrews crushed the fine bones of her hands to splinters, while crazed laughter and spittle sprayed across her face. Through it all, Maud tried to cling to thoughts of the peaceful life of service she'd known. but she felt it all slipping away like mist through her shaking fingers. By the time they finally brought her up for the mockery of a trial, Maud was a broken shell, willing to confess to anything if only to make the pain stop for a merciful instant. The magistrates needed little prodding to pronounce her guilty and condemn her to the stake. One more soul sacrificed on the altar of fear and orthodoxy. As the flames licked her ruined body and the jeers of the crowd filled her ears, perhaps Maud's last thoughts were to wonder what she had ever done to deserve such a fate. Maud's story is but one of countless tragedies to unfold in medieval dungeons, where the cruelty of men was constrained only by the limits of their dark imaginations. These dank pits bore witness to oceans of innocent blood and mountains of mangled flesh, all to slake the unquenchable thirst of unchecked power. They were holes in the world where the worst aspects of human nature ran riot, and even the strongest spirits were eventually broken on the wheel of wanton brutality. So tonight, as you feel the last leaden weights of sleep dragging your eyelids closed at last, offer up a prayer of remembrance for those lost souls like Maud, who met such grim fates in the stinking bowels of castles and keeps. Souls whose only crime was often being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or daring to defy the cruel diktat of petty tyrants. Souls for whom the warm embrace of mercy was an impossible dream, as foreign as the plush mattress that now cradles your weary form. As your mind drifts now through the mists of history, picking its way along the treacherous paths we have wandered together, remember that there is still so much to be grateful for in this moment. You are safe, warm, and free, cocooned from the casual barbarism that once lurked around every corner. The horrors we have conjured this night are but shadows, vivid, yes, but mere ghosts of a distant past that cannot hurt you now. So let them melt away like wisps of cloud scattered by the rising sun of your consciousness. Feel your mind emptying of blood and fear and filling instead with the simple contentment that is your birthright. And as the last vestiges of wakefulness dissolve into the cool, dark waters of sleep, know that you will emerge on the other side rested, refreshed, and ready to greet the new day as a gift. A gift that would be almost unimaginable to the medieval souls you have walked in the minds of tonight. Sleep now, and sleep sweetly, secure in the knowledge that the worst is behind you, and the best is yet to come. Let the whispering winds of history blow out the guttering candle of your waking mind, and surrender yourself to the warm embrace of night. The monsters are all in the past, and the morning holds nothing but promise. So breathe deeply, settle into your soft nest of blankets, and let yourself fall gently, gratefully, into the welcoming arms of oblivion. The hard roads are at an end, and you have nothing ahead of you but the sweet silence of untroubled dreams. Here is the continuation of the narration for the worst places to live during medieval times. Disease was an ever-present spectre, stalking the narrow streets and looming over every aspect of life. Without understanding of germs or hygiene, pestilence spread like wildfire through the packed neighborhoods. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, and smallpox regularly culled the population. The worst killer of all was the dreaded Black Death, which could wipe out half a town in a matter of months. Imagine the scene in a once prosperous port ravaged by the latest outbreak of plague. The sounds of trade and bustle are replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the wails of the sick and grieving. A haze of smoke hangs over the town from the constant burning of bodies. The stench of death is inescapable. Carts piled high with corpses trundle through the empty streets, their desperate drivers clothed head to toe in waxed leather, like something from a nightmare. These are the plague doctors, their beaked masks stuffed with perfumed straw to block the smell. But it's no use. They too succumb to the pestilence, just like the victims they try in vain to treat. One of these doctors was a man named Giles de Montfort. A promising surgeon, Giles left his home in Paris to help the afflicted in Marseille when the plague struck in 1720. No one knew what caused the gruesome disease, with its oozing buboes and black boils that gave the pestilence its macabre name. Giles tried everything from bleeding the ill to brewing potions of ground snake and mercury, but nothing could stop the Black Death's lethal grip. Day after endless day, Giles laboured, his bird-like mask inspiring terror as he made his rounds. At first, he recoiled from the blackened, contorted faces of the dead, but soon the corpses all blurred together into a ceaseless procession of grief. The wails of orphaned children, the desperate prayers of the dying, the shrieks of the mad. These were the sounds that filled Giles' mind as he drifted off to a fitful sleep each night, alone in a dockside garret reeking of vinegar. In time, even Giles's prodigious constitution gave out. The telltale lumps appeared on his groin, the black vomit and delirium followed. As he shivered on his cot, watching the rats scurry by, Giles's thoughts wandered to the green fields of his youth, so far from the horrors that now surrounded him. He'd only wanted to help, to heal, but the plague proved more powerful than any man's feeble efforts. Giles slipped away with a sigh like so many before him, adding one more to the plague's grim tally. The trauma of such ordeals lingered long after the disease retreated. Families were shattered, trades decimated, entire villages depopulated. The Black Death shook society to its core, and the medieval world would never be the same. But even in normal times, beyond the city walls, perils abounded. The life of a medieval peasant was one of backbreaking labour from dawn to dusk. Up to 90% of people were farmers, bound to the land in a feudal system that reaped nearly all they sowed. They endured the whims of the weather and vagaries of the harvest in a subsistence existence that was always one failed crop away from starvation. On the frontiers and borderlands, what little security people had was stripped away. Marauding bandits, invading armies, and desperate outlaws all preyed on those trying to scratch out a living in the lawless reaches beyond the protection of kings. The disputed borderlands between England and Scotland were one such place of strife. In the early 1300s, this lush but blood-soaked landscape was the scene of constant raids and skirmishes as the two kingdoms vied for supremacy. The common folk were caught in the middle, their fields burned, livestock stolen, and homes put to the torch by both sides. Imagine the scene in a humble, thatch-roofed cottage as a battle raged nearby. As we've seen, life in medieval cities was often a struggle for survival. The cramped quarters, lack of sanitation, and constant threat of disease made urban living a far cry from the romantic notions we might imagine. But for the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, even these squalid conditions could be out of reach. Many towns had a seedy underbelly where the destitute and desperate scraped by in abject poverty. These crime-ridden slums were breeding grounds for theft, violence, and exploitation. The flickering light of a tallow candle illuminates the grimy alleyways as we step into this world of cutthroats and cutpurses. Imagine the plight of a young orphan named Alice. Her parents claimed by the pox she's left to fend for herself on the unforgiving streets at the tender age of 7. By day, Alice begs for scraps and searches the midden heaps for anything of value. By night, she huddles in a dingy nook, shivering against the cold stones, clutching a rusty knife under her threadbare blanket. It's her only protection against the leering men and vicious street dogs that prowl after dark. Alice's story is tragically common in places like the rookeries of London, where life is short and brutal. Street children like her are easy prey for the gangs who control the slums with intimidation and violence. Impressionable youths are lured into a life of iniquity with the promise of food and belonging. Most end up as lookouts, thieves or worse. Few survive to adulthood. The slums also attract others fleeing a dark past or ill reputation. Scoundrels, debtors, fallen women. They mingle in the seedy taverns and brothels where silver quickly changes grubby hands, and secrets are traded in whispers. It's a precarious existence, but for some, the anonymity and opportunities of the city underworld are preferable to a life of servitude and drudgery. Take, for example, the character of Dougal Fletcher. Once a respectable cloth merchant, Dougal's fortunes turned when he defaulted on a loan to a powerful guildmaster. With his name blackened and guards sent to seize his assets, Dougal gathered what coin he could and melted into the rookeries. Using his mercantile cunning, Dougal allied himself with one of the slum's most feared crime bosses. He fences stolen goods, forges documents, and extends usurious loans to other desperate souls. Though he's lost his lofty place in society, Dougal relishes his new role as a big fish in this small, muddy pond. At night, he drinks and carouses with his newfound brethren, trying to forget the family he left behind and the man he once was. Sadly, few escape the poverty trap of the medieval slum. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle, a daily struggle to survive that leaves no time or energy for betterment. Most inhabitants end up in paupers' graves or dangling from the gallows, their poignant stories lost like tears in the rain. As we walk these mean streets, take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most challenging circumstances. And as you drift off to sleep in your safe, warm bed, spare a thought for those, past and present, who are not so fortunate. Sweet dreams. Of all the trials and tribulations of medieval life, perhaps none terrified people more than the prospect of plague. In an era without germ theory or modern medicine, these mysterious diseases struck like an invisible reaper, quickly overwhelming any attempts to treat or contain them. The most notorious of these was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that raged through Europe in the 14th century. Its cause, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was unknown at the time. To fearful medieval minds, it seemed a curse from God himself. The plague first took hold in squalid port cities like Genoa and Marseille, arriving on ships from the east. These bustling trade hubs, with their cramped quarters and poor sanitation, were ideal breeding grounds for the contagion. Imagine the terror that gripped the citizens as their neighbours began falling ill with alarming speed. It started with fever and chills, but soon the victims' lymph nodes swelled into painful boils, their skin blackened with gangrenous blood pooling under the surface. In the final throes, delirious sufferers coughed up mouthfuls of blood as their internal organs liquefied. The disease tore through families and communities like wildfire. So virulent was the plague that a person could be in perfect health at daybreak and be buried in the plague pits by nightfall. As the body count mounted, panic set in. People shuttered their doors and shunned the sick. Faith in government and the church wavered as prayers went unanswered. Social order unraveled as fear and self-preservation eclipsed all other concerns. In larger cities, the plague stalked the almshouses and rookeries where the poor huddled in squalor. But it also crept into the manor houses and counting rooms of the wealthy. None were immune from its icy grip. At the height of the epidemic, death carts piled high with rigid corpses trundled through the empty streets day and night. The stench of decay hung thick in the air. As the plague burned itself out over the span of several brutal years, it left a permanently changed world in its wake. Some towns lost more than half their inhabitants. Fields went unharvested. Crafts and trade ground to a halt. Labour shortages caused wages to rise, shifting the balance of power between nobles and peasants. The Catholic Church, whose clergy were particularly hard hit, lost much of its aura of divine authority. Medieval people had no way of knowing it at the time, but the societal upheaval caused by the Black Death sowed seeds that would ultimately sprout into the Renaissance and Reformation. Fewer workers meant more bargaining power for the common man. A crisis of faith opened the door to new philosophies and a rethinking of old hierarchies. Although the plague outbreaks of the Middle Ages had mortality rates that seem apocalyptic to us today, they also spurred advances in public health and scientific thinking that laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of infectious disease. So as you rest easy tonight, give thanks for the medical researchers and healthcare workers who work tirelessly to keep such pestilences at bay. Sleep well. As harrowing as life could be within city walls, existence was often even more precarious on the untamed frontiers of the medieval world. Far from the protection and support of large settlements, hardscrabble folk eked out a living in remote places where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred. Some of the bleakest of these frontier outposts were the isolated monasteries that dotted the fringes of Europe. Perched on windswept crags or tucked into densely forested valleys, these communities of monks sought to remove themselves from the sinful distractions of secular society and contemplate the divine through lives of asceticism and self-denial. Picture a lonely stone monastery clinging to a cliff high above a churning northern sea. Established by a breakaway religious order seeking purity through hardship, its handful of grey-robed brothers endure a daily battle against the elements just to survive. Lashed by icy rain and hail, the monastery grows little in its rocky soil, besides hardy root vegetables and sour apples. The monks must rely on a small flock of ill-tempered goats for milk and cheese, supplementing their meagre diet with whatever tough, oily fish they can pull from the waves. Hunger is a constant gnawing companion. When they're not toiling in the gardens or mending storm-damaged buildings, the brothers spend long hours in compulsory prayer and solemnity, denied even the small comforts of laughter, song, or a warming fire. At night they retire, shivering to their dank cells to sleep on thin pallets, wrapped only in their coarse woolen robes. No one feels the weight of this joyless existence more than Brother Adamnan. As a young man, Adamnan committed a shameful sin of the flesh. Disowned by his noble family, he was packed off to this remote monastery to cleanse his soul with a life of penitence. Now in his 50th year, with an aching back and hands gnarled by toil and arthritis, Adamnan grapples daily with his choice to take holy vows. Was trading fleshly pleasures for spiritual purity really worth a lifetime of cold, solitude, and ceaseless labor? He wrestles with anger at the zealous abbot who drives the brothers mercilessly, and doubt about a God who would consign his servants to such a punishing life. As he lies in his smoky, draughty cell, listening to the mournful wind keen past the arrow slit that passes for a window, Adamnan's only solace is the knowledge that he will soon meet his Maker and discover the ultimate truth. He prays it will have all been worth it in the end. Reflect for a moment on how alone and insignificant one man can feel pitted against the vast, uncaring forces of nature and the cruel austerity of religious fervour. As you slip into the forgiving softness of your bed, be thankful for the earthly comforts that people like Adamnan chose to reject in their single-minded pursuit of divine grace. May you be blessed with a deep and peaceful rest. Let's rejoin our lowly foot soldier, cold and hungry, huddled in his damp tent. Night has fallen over the siege camp, but the noxious smells and constant coughing ensure an uneasy rest. He can't escape the heavy sense that something terrible is brewing beyond the shadowy canvas walls. This weary soul is not alone in his nocturnal worries. Across the land, in farms, hovels, keeps and camps, medieval folk are no doubt also lying awake, trying to will themselves to sleep despite the gnawing anxieties that come with this harsh and unforgiving age. They may vary by circumstance, but their common theme is dread for what terrors may emerge with the dawn's light. In the pitch-black dungeons, emaciated prisoners listen intently to the scurrying of rats, wondering if sleep will bring relief or if they will join the cell's former occupants, now just brittle piles in the fetid corners. Pangs of hunger twist their innards, as if the jailer's aim is as much to starve the body as to break the spirit. High above in the Lord's chamber, even the nobility wrapped in furs and feasting on capons find their slumber uneasy. For it is they who must maintain order in these lawless times, quelling peasant revolts, fending off acquisitive neighbours, and keeping in the good graces of their superiors, lest they be supplanted. It seems the loftier the seat, the more precarious the perch. The pious monks, meanwhile, chant their pre-dawn prayers, pleading for divine mercy and guidance through the long litany of privations, meagre rations, chronic maladies, and the ever-prowling temptation of sin. Their devotion may offer some peace, but little protection against the mortal perils of the age. For indeed, regardless of rank or race, whether noble or knave, the people of the Middle Ages seldom find true repose. The solace of safety is so rare as to be almost unknown. Consider how in our modern age, we are mercifully sheltered from the worst of these ubiquitous menaces. We delight in a warm bed, a sated belly, a secure door. We need not constantly look over our shoulder or bar the shutters at night. Sleep can be savoured as it should, a restorative respite and a nightly escape from worldly concerns. So let us treasure this most basic yet precious of comforts as we drift off to a happy, healthy slumber. We can rest easy, knowing that when we wake, we will return not to some feudal landscape of poverty and peril, but to a world of possibility, a new day that we can aspire to fill with purpose and perhaps even moments of peace. The next time sleep proves elusive, we might reflect on those distant souls in their dark medieval nights who would envy us immensely this simple pleasure. May that gratitude guide us gently into grateful dreams as we whisper a thankful prayer across time for our tremendously good fortune. And so we reach the end of our journey into some of history's harsher realms. I hope you found it an enjoyable and edifying exploration. With any luck, you're now inspired to delve even deeper into the endlessly captivating drama of human civilization. Or at the very least, primed for a sound and satisfying slumber. Until our next foray into the folds of history, I bid you the sweetest of dreams. And if you've enjoyed our time together, I would so appreciate you sharing that by liking this video and subscribing to the channel so that we may embark on many more adventures to come. Thank you so much for accompanying me on this passage to the past. Good night, sleep tight, and do remember to count your blessings, historical and otherwise. Farewell for now, my dear chrononauts.